Hi, welcome. It's Saturday. We are live here on YouTube, and it's great to have you. And I hope you're having a great weekend. I hope you are enjoying your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, whatever, that kind of a thing. So I'm here on a Saturday and drinking my coffee and thinking about things. A lot going on. I wanted to talk a little bit today about something that I think about quite a bit, and I'm often asked about interviews and people who I've spoken to, people I've gotten to know, or just over time had experiences with. And today I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and I've always been very clear about this, and it's somewhat odd and interesting, but it makes sense, and it has to do with some real compelling people that I used to listen to on the old KGO, and a couple of whom individuals I got to interview, and you talk about just dream come true. And I'll talk about them. I'll mention their names right now, and then I'll go into a little soliloquy. Many of you know these people. Um, so I talked about Jim Eason and Lee Rodgers and the one and only Mayor Art Finley. Now, two of these people are deceased. One of them is still alive, to the best of my knowledge, and that's Jim Eason. I actually got to interview Lee Rodgers. Unfortunately, God, a couple of days after I interviewed Lee Rodgers, I'm not trying to be funny here, so just being factual, he passed away. And Art Finley, who used to be known as Mayor Art, was a longtime KGO mainstay in the early evening. Yeah, just an interesting guy, and they were all interesting. And look, I very much disagree with a lot of their politics, but as I've often said to a lot of people who've asked me, it kind of didn't have anything to do with the fact that they were really great broadcasters, particularly talk show hosts. They were interesting. They told great stories. They were funny. In the case of Jim Eason, who is, I believe, very much alive today. I actually talked to Jim Eason many a times. I haven't spoken to him for a few years, but last I heard, he was living up in the mountains in the area near the Motherlode. And I might as well start with Jim Eason. Jim Eason was a big time host, one of the most popular voices in Northern California, not just the KGO area, and was on KGO. And I remember Jim at 1 to 4 p.m. He was the afternoon guy. And yes, he was sort of right wing. He'd have on interesting guests. I remember in particular the noted biographer Arnaud de Bergerac. He'd had him on. He had on nobody political, Andrew Fracknoy from one of the space labs, and he's still on and does a lot of speaking with regards to space and forgive me, and NASA and all that kind of stuff. But Eason was a character. He had a theme song, the Dave Brubeck song, and it was just a great, great order. And he was folksy. I think he was born in North Carolina. In fact, I know he was born in North Carolina. And he was amongst the great KGO talk show hosts. And this was when KGO was the king in the 70s. And you had Owen Spann, you had Ron Owens in the evening. This is before Ron Owens eventually took over for Owen Spann. And then you had Jim Eason from 1 to 4. And he had guests on. He did these little short soliloquies, but he was funny. He was pointed. He could be serious. Very, very interesting radio. And you put aside politics. You put aside your own beliefs and whatever. Eason was that good. He, as I keep mentioning, he had a sense of humor. He talked about various issues, most of them centered on politics. I distinctly remember a time that many of you remember that he was very, very solid. This is when the hostages were taken in Iran. Remember the American hostages who eventually were freed the next year, right before Reagan took office. But Eason had some just phenomenal shows during that time. I was distinctively remember right around November of 79. My God, that was that, what, 40, 45 years ago? And it was, talk about must listen radio. That's what it was. And he'd go on and did little mocking of the Ayatollah. And he talked about what was taking place. It was very critical, obviously, of Carter, President Carter. And there were other things. He had just phenomenal guests on. And as I indicated, I didn't agree with a lot of his politics. I wasn't, keen on, sometimes he'd go off on political issues, but it was very scant. And a lot of his politics, even though it was conservative, it wasn't that dogma kind of politics, where that's all he spoke about. He was far from being a Mark Levin, or even though I like Mark Levin as in terms of stylistics, but it was, the politics were the least of it. You knew that he was sort of right-wingish, but he was so damn entertaining and interesting. And those of you that remember Jim Eason, I'm sure many of you do, give me feedback on that if you listened like I did. I thought he was just an incredible personality, incredible, very engrossing stories, and interesting and funny. He had all of the boxes were checked. Very, very much of a cool person. And then you had Lee Rodgers. And Lee came to KGO in the late 70s, early 80s. Then he subsequently went to KSFO. I had a chance to interview him, and I made no bones about it at the time. I loved Lee Rodgers. He was funny. He was articulate. He had a phenomenal command of the English language, and all the guests that he had was terrific. Again, sort of very, very right of center. He eventually went to KSFO and did the morning program with Melanie Morgan. Many of you remember that too. But at KGO, he's more of a kind of middle of the political spectrum, but you could tell that he was sort of right of the political spectrum. Even that said, just a delight to listen to. Interesting. Told real stories. Was no phony. Was no sound effects. It was a straight communication and simple conversation, and that's the way he was towards callers. And oh yeah, he'd get into arguments and debates, and look, whatever it was, you listened. You listened. Why? Because it was entertaining. It was engrossing. I've often said, if I'm interested in anybody or anything, I'll put aside politics. Politics doesn't dictate, in my book, this kind of sounds like it's common sense, whether or not you listen or watch. You watch or listen based on the fact of, is it interesting? Is it something, and I'm not talking about these way off, nutty, conspiratorial people like Alex Jones is a complete fraud, even before all this current bad news that he's, I don't want to get off on that. But you listen because you're interested. You're interested. And I think that's just kind of common sense. Jim Eason, interesting. Lee Rodgers, interesting. Then we go to Art Finley. Again, he was known as Mayor Art, and really, really engrossing and enlightening. He did a very, very local show on KGO, and he was on at night. He was on around 7 to 10 p.m., and he'd have on a lot of guests like local mayors, and he would talk about issues that involved Union City or Vallejo or Dublin. Yes, San Francisco too, but it was a local kind of a show. And he was funny and he could be sarcastic, kind of a asshole, but interesting and cool. And I mean, he had personality. He had none of the yups that we have today. Art Finley was I don't want to say a character because that's a wrong definition. He just had an interesting show. And again, very, very localized. And I know KGO people really, really thought he was fantastic. And um, there were other people on KGO, and I've talked about them. These three guys were tops. I've talked about Russ Coughlin. I've obviously mentioned Jim Dunbar. Um, I wasn't around when this guy was on, but I heard him as a little, believe it or not, a little kid. And I can tell that he had a tremendous, tremendous following. That's Ira Blue. Ira Blue did this kind of quasi-religious show called Clergy on the Line. It ran obviously on a Sunday morning, but he had other bits, and he drew a lot of people to KGO. And this was, God, in the early 60s. And he became huge and big and kind of that real interesting. He was even a very interesting looking character. He was a character. But what I heard and what many of you will tell me probably, because I know a lot of people watch and a lot of people were KGO listeners, that he had a tremendous following. I didn't get to listen to him much, as I told you. He did this show called Clergy on the Line. It was one of the most popular shows, not only on KGO, but throughout, Northern California. But I'm sure I'll get people who listened to Ira Blue and express what it was about Ira. In this case, it wasn't politics. I don't even know what his political bent was, but he was a very, very popular personality, talk show host on KGO. That's what made KGO so unique, so interesting, so real, was the fact that it had such phenomenal hosts just across the board. Owen Spann, Ron Owens at the time, Jim Eason, Mayor Art Finley, Dunbar. Later on, they had just a incredible potpourri of all opinions, all, styles, and you listened. And it was a big time station, was KGO. I thought I would talk about three of the various KGO hosts who drew my admiration and my following. Loved listening to those guys. And if you have any kind of feelings of your own, please let me know via my email or feedback right here on YouTube. Real quick, folks, if you like this show, if you can contribute to this site by going on my site up on the right side of the blog, just click on the PayPal. Any donation, $5, $10, whatever, as much as you can afford, whatever. I realize a lot of you don't have the means, but if you can, that would be awesome. Your contributions enable me to provide and to give you broadcasts like this, which frankly, you don't get anywhere else in the Bay Area. I appreciate your support. Many of you have contributed multiple times. Obviously, thank you. I will personally thank anybody who sends a contribution, whether it's email, whether a phone call, or both. If you do not want to be bothered, but you want to contribute, I get all that. Privacy is a major, major concern. Let me just tell you, PayPal on my site where you can contribute, it's 100% safe, secure, and many, many, many people have asked me about that. You'll have no issue. It's a very safe and secure site to donate. Take all the credit cards and what have you. Look, thanks for watching. Stay tuned. And again, thank you for contributing to my cause. That's what enables me to provide for you broadcasts like this. See you later.